72 years. That's how long Louis XIV ruled France, longer than any other monarch in history. During his reign, he built the magnificent Palace of Versailles, complete with its own town, gardens, and dedicated rail line, a microcosm of the absolute power and sophistication he wielded over France and much of Europe. But behind all this, there's a shocking secret. You see, Louis XIV hated water, and no, it wasn't because he was a germaphobe or thought baths were simply unpleasant. Rather, it was because he believed that water would kill him, and he wasn't alone. Up until the mid-19th century, doctors across Europe believed that water opened the body up to deadly diseases. So people largely avoided bathing, believing they'd contract fatal ailments. And this dangerous dogma took hold of the Sun King like nobody else. In fact, Louis XIV bathed exactly twice during his 72-year reign, once in 1668, after breaking his leg, and another time 7 years later, before having smallpox. And for the rest of his life, he saw water as a threat. Instead of baths, he covered himself in perfumed wine and powders containing heavy metals like lead, mercury, and arsenic. And though we might think of these substances as poisons today, back then, they were considered fashionable and beneficial for the skin. That is, except for their tendency to burn, blister, flake off, and occasionally kill you. Nonetheless, Louis XIV preferred these toxic alternatives to water. But why? What was so terrible about water? Well, it comes down to one simple: dirt. Louis XIV was convinced that the pores in his skin acted like natural toilets, excreting toxins and illnesses. If he bathed, these pores would close, trapping the bad stuff inside his body. And he wasn't wrong, exactly. The pores do help eliminate waste, but that's usually a good thing. Of course, Louis XIV didn't see it that way. He feared these trapped impurities would eventually poison him, so he made sure to never bathe again. This morbid fear permeated the entire French court. Every day, a small army of servants dusted the Sun King with scented powder. Then wine ladies would pour wine all over him. They scrubbed his body with bread and dried it with heated stones, carefully avoiding any leftover moisture. Because to Louis XIV, wet meant deadly. And if that sounds absolutely vile, you aren't alone. But remember, this was the height of European fashion. And believe it or not, things could be a lot worse. For example, in England, Queen Elizabeth liked to cover herself in white lead, which ended up making her skin look white, but also killing her kidneys and possibly contributing to her eventual death. Meanwhile, Louis XIV at least used wine, a far more pleasant substance than dry, powdery, flaking lead, and he certainly thought so too. After all, he was the man who made the Palace of Versailles synonymous with excess and luxury. Versailles was a testament to Louis XIV's wealth and power, but it was a disaster waiting to happen. We've talked about the opulence and extravagance of Versailles before, but what we have unmentioned yet is the fact that it had around 3 toilets for 10,000 residents. Most of the palace's inhabitants relieved themselves in a bucket, then threw the contents out the window or onto the streets below. And since the royal family ate 3 meals a day, every day, it didn't take long for the streets and rooms of Versailles to be coated in filth. Nobles and servants alike urinated in palace corners, mixing urine with rose petals and lavender to make it smell vaguely pleasant. Some scholars estimate that Versailles smelled like a latrine, even accounting for the many fountains and artificial canals that dotted the palace grounds. In fact, it might have smelled even worse, given that wastewater often carried disease and death. As gross as that all sounds, you should keep in mind that Versailles wasn't alone. Most European cities were just as dirty, filled with overflowing garbage, dying animals, and chamber pots. But the king's palace was supposed to be a beacon of civilization, a place of sophistication and cleanliness, and yet it was anything but. But maybe the royal family didn't care. After all, they spent most of their time at the lever. Now, don't get us wrong, the lever has nothing to do with bathroom habits. It was actually a bizarre royal dressing ritual that Louis XIV started. Each morning he'd sit on his elaborate toilet, clad only in a silk robe, and slowly dress himself while courtiers crowded around him. These attendants would watch intently while the king put on his underwear, stockings, shoes, wig, and finally his famous golden robes. And it wasn't just to show respect or support the king. The lever was essentially a form of peer pressure. A noble's presence at the lever implied that they approved of the king's hygiene habits, whether they did or not. And Louis XIV wanted everyone to know that he didn't wash. This wasn't a secret or something he was ashamed of. On the contrary, he proudly proclaimed that not washing kept him healthy and strong. He claimed that water made him sick, and that his method of covering himself in wine and perfumed powders was actually divine, chosen by God to keep him impervious to illness. That might sound laughable today, but remember, Louis XIV wasn't just a paranoid old man. He was the Sun King, the epitome of French power and sophistication, and he made it clear that bathing was beneath him, something for commoners, not kings. So for decades, the lever continued, with courtiers crowding around the king as he dressed, all the while pretending that it was an honor to be there, and all the while knowing full well that the king didn't wash. And that wasn't the only lever taking place at Versailles. There was also the lever de nuit, when nobles would watch the king undress for bed. And as you might imagine, it was just as uncomfortable as it sounds. The rituals may have seemed strange and uncomfortable, but to the people of Versailles, they were necessary for survival. If they wanted to stay in the Sun King's good graces and keep their status, they had to participate in the levers, even if it meant getting covered in toxic powders or enduring the smell of stale waste. In some ways, it was like being in a cult. Members were brainwashed into accepting bizarre behavior as the norm, even if it went against everything they knew to be true, and it worked. For decades, Louis XIV's courtiers participated in the levers without complaint. Of course, that doesn't mean they weren't aware of how ridiculous the whole thing was. One English visitor wrote, "There are so many people about the king that he cannot be private for anything. Indeed, there is no place in the whole court where the king can go alone." And that's putting it mildly. Aside from the leeches, Louis XIV had so many attendants that he couldn't even use the toilet in private. But why did he need so many servants? Well, part of it had to do with his size. Unlike most kings, Louis XIV was unusually tall and skinny, standing at 6'2". At his peak, he weighed less than 130 pounds. And as such, he needed lots of help getting dressed. It was a logistical nightmare, but one that the Sun King insisted on. After all, his appearance was everything, and if his shoes weren't perfectly polished or his stockings straight, it would be a scandal. Louis XIV became so obsessed with his looks that he employed a team of 18 shoemakers and nearly 50 tailors. That's almost as many people as it took to build one of Versailles' famous water features, and that's a lot of people to keep secrets. But they did, and as a result, the stench of Versailles got progressively worse. The palace became a cesspool of waste, disease, and decay, all hidden behind the perfume and facade of absolute power. Louis XIV died in 1715 after contracting an infection likely caused by his hygiene routine. Throughout his life, he suffered from chronic gout, organ damage from heavy metals, recurring infections, and finally gangrene in his leg, all as a result of diabetes. But he never changed his ways. Until his dying day, he believed that water would kill him, and that wasn't just a personal delusion. It was shared by the vast majority of Europe's elite. Today, we tend to think of Louis XIV as a symbol of decadent excess. But he wasn't just a man out of touch with reality. He was the face of a rotting system, one that killed hundreds of thousands and ultimately led to the French Revolution. His story is a stark warning. No matter how powerful or influential someone is, it only takes one crazy idea to send an entire nation into chaos. Now check out The Real Reason Marie Antoinette Was Executed, or click this other video instead.